I would come to learn that I'd been laid up for 3 days. And in that time, things had changed aboard the ship. The merriment that had been buzzing through the crew just days prior had vanished, only to be replaced by nervous whispers and a sense of trepidation. Out at open sea, surrounded by nothing but the deep blue depths, sailors tend to gossip just as females do, and once my strength had returned to me, a few of the fishermen made it their duty to catch me up on what I'd missed while I was wrought with fever. The recent trouble seemed to be stemming from an altercation that occurred the night the illness took me. As I slept so sick that I was well nigh dead to the world, an incident occurred that had rattled many of the men on the boat. And not surprisingly, it was regarding Job and the girl. The story as it had been told to me was that Anthony had been topside that evening, navigating the ship through a patch of stormy weather so as to ensure the winds did not blow us off course. When the seas had calmed, he returned to his cabin to find the old man, dagger in hand, harassing the fish girl and declaring that he aimed to kill her. The old man was bleeding awful from the side of his neck. The merwoman had taken a bite out of him after he'd made an earlier pass at her with his blade. Gushing his wound was, too. A crimson pool had collected at his feet, but despite the blood loss, Job had a fire burning so bright inside him that night that he had moved beyond all reason. Anthony ordered him to halt, but the old man refused to yield to his commands. He wanted only to bury his dagger into the merwoman's heart, and there was no threat the Scot could make that would deter him from his mission. All else had become trivial to the old man. Job backed the girl into a corner and raised the knife over his head and readied himself to come down on her with the point of his blade, but the Scot was quicker and stronger than he. Before the gray-haired beggar could drive his dagger into her chest, Anthony dashed across the room and sunk a knife of his own between the blades of his shoulders. The men who had witnessed this said Job then folded like a book, crumpling to the floor an instant later. As it turned out, the first mate's knife had delivered a fatal blow, but the old man did not pass quietly into the afterlife. He groaned and howled for minutes. Some of the crew tried to tend to him, but the beggar's injuries were too severe. Anthony's knife was buried down to the hilt. In time, Job's breathing shallowed, his eyes began to dim, but just before his soul would leave his body and travel to the heavens, or down to hell, where I believe it may have been destined. He raised a finger toward the first mate and uttered his final words. "She's his master now." The cap did not reprimand Anthony for killing Job. After all, he was only a beggar, and as I said before, the old man did not have many friends aboard the ship. Nevertheless, he was given a proper eulogy the next morning, and his body was buried at sea. The Scot, however, was absent from the ceremony, and it was then that the rumors began. Those who witnessed what happened did not believe that lethal force had been necessary. Anthony was one of the strongest sailors on the ship and could have easily subdued the frail old man without the use of his knife. The girl he was harboring was an unnatural, frightful thing. Strangely beautiful, though, she was. And with the death of Job, much of the crew was beginning to grow nervous about her presence on our vessel. Mayhaps the old man's final words were getting to him. This is something I cannot say for sure, but a bit of mild panic had broken out amongst the men, and it seemed to have spread like a plague while I was ill. A lot of them knew little about the feeding practices I'd been assisting Anthony with in secret before my fever struck. I'm sure their fears would have swelled considerably if privy to that information. So I thought it best to keep my mouth closed when they started prodding me about such things during our discussions. No need to fan the flames, I thought, especially when we were so close to our destination. Anthony might have been able to quell concerns himself had he appeared on the deck now and again, following Job's death, but for much the time I was sick, he'd been cooped up in his quarters, battling an apparent fever of his own. Word amongst the men was that the captain had checked on him, and upon seeing his condition feared for his first mate's health. He ordered Anthony to relinquish the girl so another sailor could mind her while he recovered, but the Scot had somehow talked him out of it. Ill he may have been, but Anthony was still a persuasive and powerful speaker. He managed to convince the cap to send him a hand instead, so as to help him feed the girl, since I was too delirious from fever to offer my assistance. The man's name was Jacob. He was a young fisherman from a poor village. He had learned everything he knew about sailing while working aboard the ship. He, too, had been questioned by the others about Anthony and the girl, but refused to talk of them. However, once he heard that my fever had passed, he sought out to converse about our shared experiences. Anthony approached me the afternoon I awoke from my watery nightmare, and requested that we speak in private. He found an isolated spot at the hull of the boat. It was only there, where he knew others would not hear our discussion, that he felt secure enough to open up to me. The young fisherman spoke in a hushed tone, and I knew from the cadence of his voice and the way his hands gripped me tight around my shoulders, he was very troubled. "Anthony has mandated that I do not speak of my chores outside of his cabin," Jacob whispered to me. His silky blonde hair had fallen over his face for a moment. He looked almost mad. "He knows his practices are unconventional and fears it would upset the crew if they were told how he goes about the girls' feedings." I nodded in agreement. For in the many years I've walked this earth, I've come to recognize that even a fool alone in distress is far more rational than a collection of great thinkers when dangers are hanging over their heads. "But you've been present for them too," he continued. "You were helping feed the girl before the illness fell upon you, before I was chosen to take your place." I remained silent as it was not yet my turn to speak. Something was weighing heavily on the young man's heart. A secret he felt a need to disclose. "The only thing that's kept me sane during the time I spent with the Scot was knowing that you had not run screaming from his cabin after witnessing those horrors." Jacob paused for a moment and bit his bottom lip. His face was rife with terror. I bade him to carry on, so he took a deep breath and glanced over his shoulder. Once he saw no one was in earshot, he resumed his account. "The things he did, the way he fed himself to her." Then his voice trailed off again, and his dark brown eyes fell to his boots. It was difficult for him to relive those moments. I placed my hand atop his shoulder to soothe the young man's worries. "Aye, friend," I replied with a smile. "It is a dreadful habit he's developed." I assumed that Jacob was speaking of the very same practice I had witnessed Anthony partake in with the merwoman. His disgust was something I found reasonable. Watching the Scot carve the flesh from his arm was a sickening sight to behold. But Jacob was acting as if he'd crossed the path with the devil himself. When he spoke, his voice quaked with fright, and his lips quivered like the puckered strings of a lute. I thought mayhaps his fear were understated, but when the young man opened his mouth again, I began to reconsider the notion. "Dreadful! If only one could describe such things with a word as modest as dreadful. Nay, there's no way to express the horrors I witnessed inside the man's cabin. Tell me how you managed to keep your sanity. I saw you those first few days. When you weren't assisting him, you walked about the ship as if nothing were the matter. How did you keep your conscience clear, knowing full well what he was allowing the creature to do to him?" I shrugged my shoulders. But before I could answer him, Jacob started up again. "He said it was for the good of the ship, but I won't be a part of it anymore. Now that you're well, I'll be informing Anthony that I no longer wish to aid him while he feeds himself to that terrible thing. If it doesn't frighten you, then I beg you to take my place. God, how he allowed her to eat him alive! The way she sank her teeth into his chest and stomach, that awful hymn he would recite that burned my ears. He sang them aloud with a smile on his face as she devoured him, as she sucked the blood from his veins." I tried my best to calm him, but Jacob had worked himself into a frenzy. His face bore the desperate look of an injured animal, and all of my words appeared to fall on deaf ears. It seemed as if he was losing his mind before my very eyes. Of a sudden, the young fisherman spun around and ran off. He stormed below the deck, and I knew he was heading to the first mate's quarters. I didn't try to follow him, though. The last few things he'd been yammering on about had made me hesitate. From what I could gather, Jacob's time with Anthony sounded far different than my own. Never did he let the girl bite him directly into the flesh, while I assisted him, and the part about her drinking his blood sent a chill through my body. I pondered, too, about the hymns the young man spoke of and found myself thinking back to the dark monks of my dreams, wondering if they and the first mate's songs were one and the same. Moments later, I would hear a scream rise up from the berth. And I knew at once that it came from Jacob. By the time I arrived below deck, a dozen men had gathered around the first mate's quarters. Jacob was shouting and holding his arm, and I could see the sleeve of his shirt was stained a deep red. "You blasted beast!" he shouted. "You godforsaken animal!" Anthony was in the doorway. He had put himself between the crew and the girl. Blood was smeared across her face, and it looked as though she was still chewing a piece of the young man in her mouth. I peered back at Jacob and realized then just how much muscle she had torn from his arm. Jacob's wound was spilling like a waterfall. I could see the bone of his forearm, a flap of his flesh, attached by only a single piece of skin, dangled loosely from the mangled limb. "Ah! It burns like fire! Like a flame to my flesh!" The men were trying to console him, but the young sailor had fallen into a panic. The captain had entered the berth by now, having been lured by all the commotion. He instructed some of the crew to take Jacob topside and help him dress his injury. It took 4 men to pull him away, kicking and screaming from the first mate's door. I stayed behind. Jacob was bucking like a wild horse, and though my health had improved, I was still weak from my fever's lingering effects. Once he was gone, Anthony stepped outside of his cabin and closed the door behind him to address the cap. "He burst in like a madman, Captain," Anthony explained. "No fair warning at all, not even a single knock. It startled the girl." This is the first time in days that I'd gotten a look at the Scot, and I understood then why the cap had been so worried about his well-being. Anthony looked to still be suffering from what had been ailing him. His face as pallid as a phantom floating through the fog, and it seemed as if he'd lost considerable weight. His movements were sluggish. Even each of his steps demanded the will of the world. Even his curly hair that had been such a vibrant, fiery red just days before had dulled to a drab orange. Anthony gazed out at the remaining men through a pair of glossy, tired eyes, set deep in the sunken sockets of his face. And a strange thought then crossed my head. The look of a man waiting for death to take him. "How much farther, Anthony?" asked the captain. "The crew was restless, and I can't be having any more of this nonsense on this ship." "We'll be reaching the grotto before next eve, Captain," Scott muttered out. And when he said that, the cap's eyes gleamed. For the briefest of moments, driven by the promise of riches he was. So much so that he'd begun to let the treasure consume his every waking thought. The cap scratched his beard, while he contemplated the first mate's answer. "Good then," he finally responded. "And how are you feeling?" "I'm strong enough to make the journey, but I need me rest." The captain turned to face the rest of us. "Well, you heard him," he barked. "Let him rest. Tomorrow we drop anchor, and there'll be no more disturbing him till then." Fever struck Jacob that night. Just after dark had begun to settle in, and by the time the sun had fully sunken below the edge of the sea, the young fisherman had been reduced to an unconscious, babbling, sweat-soaked mess of a man. The crew was in an uproar. Their fears had more than doubled once word of poor Jacob's condition had traveled through the ship. I pitied him, knowing full well how terrible my own illness had been, and prayed that he made a swift recovery. I believed that our fevers had been connected. After all, the only 3 men who had fallen ill on the ship had each felt the merwoman's teeth pierce their flesh. Mayhap her bite was venomous. This is something I now know to be true, though. I would have no idea just how potent her poisonous mouth could be until a good deal later. The cap himself stood guard outside Anthony's door that night, so as to prevent a repeat of the Job incident from earlier. This worked well enough to suppress any budding untrust. The night passed along without a skirmish, and before I knew it, the sun had begun to reappear over the eastern horizon. The morning passed by easily enough, though tensions throughout the ship were still high. I found myself sharing laughs with a few of the men who were waiting to hear word from the cap. It wasn't until midday he made his way up topside to speak to us. His eyes were red and swollen from the lack of sleep, and his arms hung loose and heavy, like pendulums from his shoulder. When he spoke, I could hear the fatigue in his voice, but his eagerness for adventure and hunger for wealth still apparent. "Today is the day we make our fortune, men," he said to us. "Today, we become rich." And then, in a moment so timely that it must have been orchestrated by the fates themselves, the excited shouts of a crewmate called down from the crow's nest above our heads. "I see it! I see it! Len Ho!" By the time we drifted into the bay, the late afternoon sky was beginning to rust, and it looked as if the heavens were cast from copper. The island was so small a man could set out on foot at dawn, explore every nook and crevice of its terrain, and still return back to where he started before evening came about. The beach was littered with palms. Birds with bright feathers and hooked beaks grazed its sandy shores. Beyond that was a lush garden, full of ferns, colorful flowers, and exotic trees. Anthony appeared topside with the girl shortly after the beaches first came into sight. He navigated the ship to a cove tucked away in a rocky corner of the isle. Here is where we were told we could expect to find the Golden Grotto. The mouth of the cave was too narrow for our ship, so we lowered 3 whalers into the water and rowed out. There were 6 of us to a boat. Mine brought up the rear, while the boat with Captain Anthony and the fish girl led our modest procession. Most of the crew stayed on board of the ship, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I envied them. For it, as my trust in the Scot had been waning since the prior day's incident with Jacob. The other men in my whaler must have felt the same way, for the faces were grim and cheerless. There was gloom hanging in the air, and I felt less like a treasure hunter and more like a doomed soul embarking on a one-way voyage down the river Styx. Our boats were rigged with harpoons. We were fishermen, not soldiers, and the Cap was the only one amongst us 3 vessels carrying a pistol. At a glance, the grotto was by no means remarkable. After hearing Anthony talk of it, I had been expecting marble statues and jewel-encrusted archways, but the mouth of the cave was small and ordinary, and our heads nearly touched the ceiling as we paddled inside. We used torches to light our way through the darkness. I thought my nose had grown numb to the stench of fish, but the smell inside the cave was so harsh and overpowering that it caused my eyes to water. Black rock formations rose out of the water's surface, like tentacles of a kraken, and our voices bounced hollow off the walls. Aye, the grotto was a peculiar place indeed, but peculiar for all the wrong reasons. The Scot had promised us a wondrous vault full of precious emeralds and rubies. But the deeper into the cave we traveled, the more I felt my dreams of riches drift away. The walls were made of stone, not diamonds, and even the slightest hint of gold was absent from its murky waters. A steady unease was growing throughout the group as we sneaked our way down the grotto's narrow canal. So deep we had journeyed into the treacherous cave that the mouth of the cave was no longer in sight. The flames from our torches were casting strange shadows on the walls. They danced and frolicked across the rocks like ghastly spirits. A feeling of dread was beginning to swell inside me like a rising black tide, and I feared I might never gaze upon the sky. Eventually our party came upon a dead end. But this only gave my worries even more reason to flourish. Now the promise of treasure seemed further away than ever. I know that I was not alone in this thought, because after some time it was the Cap himself who turned to Anthony and began to question him. "Where are the rubies, Anthony?" he demanded. "Where are the pearls and the emeralds you spoke of?" These words were full of rage, but the Scot said nothing. His only response to the captain's interrogation was to stare so cold and distant that I briefly thought he might have been dead. "Answer me!" shouted the Cap. And when he said this, he lowered the barrel of his pistol between the first mate's eyes. "Where's the gold? Where's the diamonds?" The girl leaned over the edge of the boat and dipped her webbed fingers into the water. Aloof and childlike was her demeanor, as if completely oblivious to the ruckus the Cap was raising. The torchlight reflected red off her scaly skin, and I remember thinking that she looked like hell incarnate. The captain cocked his pistol so as to impress his point upon the Scot, but Anthony sat in silence, never flinching, only breathing. "Captain!" one of the men shouted out. There be something in the water. The lot of us then spun around and saw 6 heads breach the water's surface. Now I know you may think me mad, but I'd recognize the creatures. The creatures from my nightmares. I was now face to face with the very same wretched monks that had tormented me during my fevered dreams. A chill ran through my body once this realization came to pass. That fishy smell had somehow grown more potent, so much so that it left its foul flavor in my throat. Every time I drew a breath, time seemed to stop as we stared, in awe, at the horrid things treading water before us. A scream rose up from behind me, sharp and jawing. It pierced the moment like the tip of a dagger, and when I turned in its direction, I saw that it was coming from the cap. The fish girl had ambushed him from behind while his attention had been diverted. Her arms were wrapped tight around his shoulders, and those shark teeth of hers had buried themselves into the side of his neck. He fired a desperate shot, but alas, the cap was too far gone. The bullet missed completely, and when he tried to cock his pistol again, his fingers betrayed him, and he dropped his weapon into the dark waters. The blood running down his throat looked black against the glow of the torchlight. Again and again she tore away at his flesh, opening his wound larger with each bite. Anthony did nothing to stop her. The other men in the boat pulled at her arms and legs, but the girl's grip was strong and they couldn't pry her loose. I glanced back towards the mermen just in time to see the last of them dive out of sight. Seconds later, our boats were rocking back and forth, and I knew they intended to tip us over. Out of instinct, I snatched the harpoon and jabbed it into the water, though I couldn't see a thing beneath the surface, and my spear came up empty each time. A mate in the second boat did the same, but the merman lunged up and grabbed hold of the harpoon's shaft, then pulled the poor bastard overboard. He breached just long enough to let out a horrible cry before the creature pulled him back under. The girl continued to feast on the captain, but his screaming had sunk into a pitiful groan. No longer did he have the strength to struggle. His throat was red and gnarled. It looked like raw meat. My boat was the last to capsize, and by the time it hit the water, the wicked things were already swarming the sunken sailors, just as piranhas do. They glided through the water with incredible speed and grace, attacking from every angle and tearing into the men with ease. The cave was pitch dark now. The torches had been extinguished, but I could feel the creatures moving all about me. My crewmen's garbled cries told me just how deadly those waters were. But even the sounds of the slaughter didn't disturb me as much as Anthony's voice when I heard it, chanting out amidst the madness. Flat and colorless, it sounded as if the first mate was under the influence of a spell. He recited those blasphemous prayers, the very same I had heard in my nightmares, as the creatures massacred our friends and brothers all around us. I shut my eyes and began to swim. The fish people were faster than I. This I knew, but I reasoned that fleeing was my only chance to survive. I couldn't see a thing in the darkness, so I used the screams of my fellow sailors to guide me. I swam from the carnage as fast as my arms and legs would allow me. So sure was I that I'd soon be meeting my death that I had already begun to make a peace with the thought of their teeth shredding my flesh. I could hear the blood-soaked cries of my crewmates even after I emerged from the cave. I gazed over the cove as my eyes adjusted to the twilight, and I saw the ship still anchored in the bay. The sight was indeed a relief, but I knew I was far from safe. As long as I was in those waters, I was nothing more than prey. I felt myself grow weary. My heart was pounding inside my chest like the stampeding hooves of 1,000 horses. My muscles were aching terribly, and my vision was growing blacker by the minute. Once or twice as I made my escape, I thought I caught the fishy stench of the cave. But every time I peered over my shoulder expecting to see those things chasing me down, I found that I was still alone. My mind was fading fast, and I feared if the fish people didn't kill me then, the cove's warm, tropical waters would. But just before darkness grabbed me, I felt myself plucked from the seas as if by an angel and pulled aboard a boat. When I opened my eyes, I saw the worried faces of my crewmates staring down at me. One of them attempted to ask me questions, but I'm afraid to say my memory completely leaves me at that. Next thing I recall, I was back in my hammock aboard the ship. I had awoken from yet another deep sleep. So long I napped that we were already more than halfway home. Many days had passed since that bloody afternoon. I was told by the crew that they had lowered a rescue boat into the water when they heard the crack of the captain's pistol. But the screams pouring from the grotto had deterred them from entering the cove, and so they waited until they spotted me making my escape. The men said that my eyes were wild when they pulled me from the drink, and that I yelled and blathered like a madman, but my warnings had frightened them enough to turn back and leave the rest for dead. I passed out by the time they brought me aboard the ship. Not long after, they raised the mainsail and decided to make a hasty departure. I spoke to Jacob while I recovered below the deck. His fever had left him, and he was eager to talk about the nightmares he suffered through. When I told him of the grotto, he said the scene I described unfolded just the way he experienced in his dreams. He saw that awful city as well, and witnessed those monks and that wicked high priest performing the same depraved rituals that I observed. That was all many years ago. I left the fishing business and moved as far inland as I could. Jacob, too, retired early. He traveled back home to live and care for his elderly mother. But even though we went our separate ways, the two of us made sure to keep in correspondence. You see, we shared a mutual bond. Those awful dreams still haunted us, and they were often the main topic of conversation in our letters. We believed it was the fish girl's bite that induced it, and that mayhaps her venom still flowed inside our veins. I looked forward to hearing from him because he was the one person I felt I could speak freely to about my nightmares. Through our discussions, we tried to decipher hidden meanings in our dreams. We researched the ancient runes that were carved inside the dark church, and tried our best to translate the monks' language, though we made little progress in our endeavor. In his letters, Jacob often spoke of a book that he was searching for, an ancient tome written by a mad Arab that he believed would hold the answers to our questions. To my knowledge, he never tracked it down. But I wonder if the book could have helped him once things took a turn for the worse. I started to worry for my friend. A little over a year ago, his words began to sound paranoid, and I noticed a rapid decline in his penmanship. He told me his dreams were now unbearable, and that they had been weighing heavy on his thoughts. This concerned me most of all. Then a few months later, I stopped receiving letters from him altogether. I wrote him many times, inquiring about his well-being, but never received a response. And so, after some time, I've decided to pay him a visit. His village was out on the coast. It was the first time in years that I had seen the ocean, and I was surprised to find myself undisturbed by the sight of it. Nay, in fact, I found comfort in its rolling blue waves. His mother answered the door when I arrived at Jacob's home. I introduced myself as an old friend, but a look of grief struck her face when I uttered his name. And right away I knew my fears had been confirmed. She said that a terrible tragedy had occurred. It seemed as though Jacob's final letters had only revealed a small sliver of his tormented soul. His mother told me just how much he'd changed over the past year. He'd become detached, standoffish. She said he was full of anger, and that he often woke up screaming in the night. The man I knew was a devout Christian, but she said he had renounced the church. And when she asked him why, he would only talk of crazy things, as she would say, like ancient beings and sleeping gods. His behavior, too, had begun to scare her, but she was old and feeble, and feared if she spoke out then, he might strike her. And then, early one morning, while his mother still slept, he stripped himself bare, walked naked through the village, and threw himself from a pier. He fell like a stone into the sea. A few fishermen setting out for the day witnessed the whole thing unfold. They said he was ranting and speaking in tongues, and it seemed as though he was talking to the ocean itself. His body was recovered, and a memorial service was held in his honor. At the time, I felt pity for him. I thought mayhaps his dreams had worn away at his mind, like waves do against the face of a cliff. But this, I now know, is not entirely true. Mayhap it was my proximity to the coast. But soon I too began to have a new vivid dream, but they haven't stopped since I ventured out to Jacob's village. Each nightmare seems more real and frightening than the ones that came before. In them I see more underwater cities filled with monstrous creatures like the High Priest from my fever dream, but now their history is told to me as I sleep. These deep ones have lived for millennia below the ocean's surface. It is they who rule the fish girl and have carnivorous brethren. They view these mer people as abominations and an early failed attempt to breed with the human race. But they tolerate their existence and let them worship in their sunken temples. They are used in religious rituals, sometimes given up as a sacrifice to Father Dagon and Mother Hydra. Other times they're utilized by the Deep Ones to manipulate man. I am sure now that there never was a golden grotto, nor was the girl really a queen of the sea, but the venom of her bite was powerful, and I think I can still feel it taking effect even today. The thought of land now repulses me. For a week I've been in this village on the coast, and have not been able to peel myself away. I want to go home, but the ocean won't allow it. It beckons me. I can hear its voice calling in the wind, gusting over the water, begging me to take the plunge just as Jacob did. He wants a sacrifice. And the more I dream, the harder it is for me to fight these urges. There is a realm of wonders that is unknown to man, dark, cyclopean cities beneath the sea, magnificent, inconceivable spectacles. The Deep Ones build churches there and worship all-powerful gods, sleeping gods that will return, and when they do, it will mean the end of the world. I used to think man ruled the sea, that the creatures dwelling in the depths were ours to hunt and kill, but the venom in my blood has pulled the veil from my eyes and revealed the harrowing truth. We are nothing in this world. Its true kings will show themselves soon enough. I can hear the prayers of those monks now, even when I'm awake. They haunt me and remind me of this fact. He sleeps, they tell me. He sleeps. But I know that he will not sleep forever, for the day will eventually come when he rises from his slumber.
The